and only about 16 people in Australia with my second name, and I think I'm the only one with both of them, so that probably is me. Thanks to VCOSS for the invitation to talk to you this morning about the recent federal and state budgets and their context and impact, as I call it there. And I guess where I want to start really is in talking about the context in which the federal and then the Victorian government budgets have been brought down, because I'm going to assume that most of you are across the details of each of those budgets that impact on your sectors or on your organisations. And I don't pretend that I can tell you anything about that you don't know already, but maybe some of the things that I can tell you about why governments, federal and state, are framing their budgets in the way that they are will be helpful to the business that you have to do. And the most important thing about the context in which the federal government brought down its budget is a global one. It's, I've argued for a long time, the most important thing happening in the world yesterday, today and tomorrow for the foreseeable future is the shift in the global centre of economic gravity from west to east. And you'll notice that I've put the word back in parentheses there because I like to emphasise that what's often described as the emergence of China and India as the world's, or among the world's most important economies, is better understood as those two countries reclaiming the place in the international economic pecking order that they've occupied for most of recorded human history. What this chart here actually is a chart showing the share of global GDP, the volume of goods and services produced by different countries or regions at different intervals over the last 2,000 years, plus the projection for 2020. Now, as I'm sure you know, for most of that period, certainly back in the year one, and for about 1950 years after that, there actually wasn't too much effort made by the authorities at the time to collect economic statistics and measure GDP. These figures are, for the most part, actually the result of the lifetime work by an economist called Angus Maddison, who used to work at the OECD, and he spent much of his career backcasting estimates of economic activity at different points through history based on whatever information was available at the time. So obviously the further you go back into history, the more hairy these numbers are. But nonetheless the best we've got. And what I hope you'll notice from these is that at least up until about 1500, the biggest two economies in the world were China and India. And that was because then, as now, they had the world's biggest populations. And at least up until around 15 or 1600, they were also the most technologically advanced societies in the world. Because from the fall of the Roman Empire in 475 AD until around 15 or 1600, that is before the United States had been invented, Western Europe was under the tutelage of the medieval Catholic Church, an institution that sent people to the torture rack if they dared to think that the earth revolved around the sun, or any other revolutionary thoughts, that banned the borrowing and lending of money at interest by its followers, and in various other ways stifled the kind of intellectual as well as business activities that we associate with various forms of economic progress today. And while they were doing that, meanwhile, China and India were forging ahead economically on the basis of things they'd invented and discovered for themselves, like printing money, gunpowder, cotton ginning, silk manufacturing, modern algebra, and things like that. It wasn't really until Western Europeans began to think independently for themselves to develop some of the rudiments of what we now know today as the capitalist system, and in particular to harness various forms of energy for purposes beyond simply heating homes, that Western Europe actually began to experience what we would today call increases in per capita income. And while they were doing that and exploiting the military power that came with economic progress, and thus starting to exert their influence over the other parts of the world, China began a 300 or 400 year period of decay, beginning when they turned their back on engagement with the rest of the world, when colonial powers began to make incursions into Chinese territory. And then for the first half of the 20th century, China spent fighting vicious wars among itself and with the Japanese, followed by 25 years of murder and mayhem under Mao Zedong, who, as you probably know, was directly or indirectly responsible for more deaths than Hitler and Stalin combined. Meanwhile, India was formally occupied by the British beginning in the 17th century. And although that left India with a love of cricket and bureaucracy and a railway system that works some of the time, it wasn't actually a profitable experience for the vast bulk of Indians. They gained their independence in 1948 and, in a sense, unfortunately, then had to experience, under 3 generations of the Nehru family, experiments in various forms of socialism that they picked up while studying in Oxford or the Sorbonne. And the end result of what was 300 or 400 years of bad government, not necessarily by the choice of any of the people of those countries, was that by about 1980, China and India, which in, say, 1066 had higher standards of living than the people of Western Europe, had by 1980 per capita incomes that were only about 5% of those of the people of Western Europe and the United States. And it was partly because modern communications had enabled people in China and India to see for themselves just how far they'd fallen behind not only Western Europe and the United States, but perhaps more importantly, other Asian economies like Japan, Korea, Singapore and Malaysia, that the governments of those countries in very different ways, not only from each other, but in some respects from those other Asian economies, began to pursue policies that, as we now know, have enabled those countries to sustain rates of economic growth close to double digits, or in some cases higher per annum, and in so doing have lifted more people out of poverty than at any other time in human history. And I mention all of that potted, and I acknowledge simplified version of a couple of thousand years ago, in order to make the point that there is no reason at all now to expect that China and India are all of a sudden going to veer away from a course that has served the vast majority of their people, though by no means all of them, so well for 20 and 30 years respectively. I mean, yes, those countries are going to have economic cycles and ups and downs. And in China's case, demographic factors are going to have a significant impact on their economic growth, because as a result of the one-child policy that's been pursued since 1979, China, though it still has a developing country's income, has a rich country's age profile, and its labour force is starting to stop growing. And inevitably, that's going to make it harder for them to sustain 10% per annum economic growth for the next 10 to 15 years. But don't be in any doubt that these countries have a long way to go before they've caught up with other middle-income Asian countries like Korea, let alone advanced ones like Japan, the United States and Western Europe. And their governments have every intention of pursuing policies that will get them there. So the IMF, for example, says in its most recent set of forecasts that China will move past the United States to become the world's biggest economy by 2015. It's only 4 years away. Of course, when it does that, China will still have almost 5 times as many people as the United States. So its per capita income will still be barely more than 20% that of the average American. It will still be a poor country. But that only serves to reinforce how much longer this process of industrialisation, urbanisation and economic development has to go in Asia. And if anything, one of the lingering effects of the global financial crisis has been to accelerate this transition of economic power and might from west to east. Because the global financial crisis has left all of the major advanced economies, and many of the smaller ones, with unsustainable levels of public debt. In many ways, the major advanced economies were always going to be vulnerable to something like this because they had done very little to put their own public financial houses in order during the years before the onset of the financial crisis when economic growth in most of them was quite strong. That didn't stop them wagging their fingers at finance ministers from developing countries saying they'd never achieved strong economic growth unless they put their fiscal houses in order. But when the global financial crisis hit in 2008, as you can see, or you could see if it wasn't for that black bar across the middle of the chart there, the average rich country had a ratio of public debt to GDP of about 80%. Inevitably, when the recession induced by the financial crisis occurred, the budget deficits of those countries deteriorated simply because of the impact of rising unemployment and falling corporate revenues on tax collections and spending on unemployment benefits. That always happens in a recession. But because of the peculiar nature of the recession that the global financial crisis induced, one which meant that banks could no longer lend and people and companies didn't want to borrow, the usual remedy for a recession, cutting interest rates, even to zero in many Western countries, didn't work. And governments therefore found themselves obliged to engage in discretionary fiscal policy, that is, deliberately to cut taxes or increase government spending, in order to prevent what was in any case the worst recession most Western countries had experienced since the end of the Second World War, from becoming something even worse than that. And on top of that, many Western governments had to use taxpayers or borrowed money to bail out parts of their banking system, and in America's case, to bail out two of their three big automakers and their largest insurance company besides. So the financial crisis resulted in public debt in major advanced economies rising to around 100% of GDP today, and is on track to reach 120% of GDP on average by 2015. Now, there is no hard and fast rule, unfortunately, which allows you to say that at some particular point, the ratio of public debt to GDP becomes unsustainable and default or financial crisis is inevitable. We certainly know that once public debt to GDP exceeds 90%, growth tends to slow quite significantly. But beyond that, all we know is that whatever the figure is, it is higher for big countries with a widely diversified economic base than it is for relatively small ones or ones that are dependent on one or two main sectors. We also know that the figure is higher for the country that happens to be the issuer of the world's principal reserve currency and therefore borrows in its own currency rather than someone else's than it is for anyone else. But beyond that, we can't really tell almost until a country has a financial crisis. What I think we can say is that this kind of level will almost certainly prove unsustainable, so that countries in that position, and that's almost all major Western economies today, with the exception of Australia, New Zealand, and the Nordic countries, countries in that position essentially have a choice between laying out a credible plan to cut spending and or increase taxes in such a way as to get the level of public debt on a downward trajectory relative to GDP in order to forestall a financial crisis. And that's the choice that, for example, the British government has made since coming to office in May last year. Or alternatively, countries can pretend that they don't have to do that and wait until they have a financial crisis and then have to do that more abruptly in circumstances where business and consumer confidence has been severely shaken by the fact that the country's had a financial crisis. And that's where Greece, Ireland and Portugal find themselves. And it's where I think the United States and maybe even Japan will find themselves if at some point they don't make the same sort of choices that Britain has decided to make. Now, despite what you might think, the financial market don't actually have particularly strong views as to whether what needs to be done to get the public debt on a sustainable path is done through increases in taxes or cuts in government spending. That's a matter of politics. In the United States in particular, most people in the financial market would recognise that taxes have to go up, as well as government spending, particularly in some areas like defence and entitlements, have to be brought under control. But financial markets, who after all are the ones who finance these budget deficits, don't have limitless patience, aren't willing to hand over other people's savings indefinitely without asking fundamental questions as to whether they will ultimately be repaid. And so inevitably in major Western countries, the need to either raise taxes or cut government spending over a long period of time is going to dampen the prospects for economic growth in Western Western Europe, the United States and Japan for probably the best part of a decade. Whereas in general, emerging and developing countries don't face that need at all. Hence why I say that one of the lingering effects of the financial crisis is to accelerate the transition in economic power and might from west to east. Something else that's important, especially for Australia, flowing from this transition in economic power and might is the upward pressure it's placing on commodity prices. Now that's because countries like China and India are now passing through a stage of economic development that most Western countries went through between, say, the 1850s and the 1950s, or in Japan's case, between about 1950 and 1980, when as incomes rise from about $3,000 per head, which is where India is today, through $6,000 per head, where China is today, up to about $15,000 to $20,000 per head, where the precise figure depends on the distribution of income as well as its level. So as countries pass through that stage of economic development, typically most households spend most of their additional income on consumer durables or housing, and governments typically spend a lot of their revenues on urban infrastructure, roads, buildings, electricity generation, that sort of thing. And the common thing about those is that they require a lot of commodities to create them in the first place and then to operate them. So as countries move through that phase of economic development, and the two most populous nations in the world are now doing that, there tends to be a much stronger relationship between economic growth and demand for commodities. They're either when countries have incomes of less than that, less than 3,000, in which case most people are engaged in subsistence agriculture and don't buy much by way of consumer durables or housing. Or once they get above around 15,000 to 20,000 and people start spending most of their income on services, education, health, financial services, recreation, entertainment, and the commodity content of that is pretty small. So what we're seeing in the world economy at the moment, and probably for at least another 10 to 15 years, is substantial increases in the demand, not only for minerals and energy, but also food commodities, as rising incomes allow people to afford to buy more protein-intensive diet that creates demand for more grain to feed animals that are in turn used for meat, for example. And at the same time, the supply of many commodities is constrained, particularly oil, because although I'm not an adherent of some of the more extreme peak oil theories, there's no doubt that there hasn't been any significant discoveries of large quantities of recoverable oil anywhere in the world really for about 25 years. And so particularly when it comes to oil, the likelihood is that oil price is going to be close to or above $100 a barrel at any point in time unless there's another global recession. Now, higher commodity prices, of course, higher commodity prices do mean higher inflation of food and energy prices for people. And in developing countries where food represents 40% of the consumer price index basket, and where rising food prices are often a source of social unrest, that's something that central banks in developing countries cannot ignore. And you will see, as we have done over the last year, news about governments in those countries, central banks in those countries, tightening monetary policy in various ways in an attempt to contain those inflationary pressures. Of course, higher food prices also impact people in Western countries too, as do higher petrol prices. But in Western countries, food and energy prices typically represent only about 10 to 15% of the consumer price index basket. I acknowledge it's higher for people on lower incomes, but the inflation rate represents the rise in the cost of living for the population as a whole. And for the most part, central banks can afford to look through or ignore the impact of higher food and energy prices on inflation in Western countries. So we're not seeing the same pressure on interest rates in countries like America, Europe, and Japan, despite rising food and energy prices, because unemployment is so high in those countries that producers couldn't pass on those higher prices to consumers in any sense. Australia's experience has been vastly different from that of most other Western countries. Our relationship with the global economy is in many ways much more like that of a developing country than it is an advanced country, largely because of our commodity endowment. We were also, in a sense, lucky, although good management had a role to play in it, that we didn't experience anything like the economic trauma that other Western countries did as a result of the financial crisis. The chart on the left here shows the level of GDP, the broadest measure of economic activity that we have, for a variety of countries that we normally compare ourselves with. indexed to the December quarter of 2007, that is just before the onset of the financial crisis, was 100. And you can see that, for example, Canada and the United States have only just now regained the level of economic activity that they had before the financial crisis hit them. Britain, continental Europe, Japan, and even New Zealand still haven't got back to where they were before the financial crisis started. Whereas in Australia, even though GDP contracted by 1.2% in the March quarter, as we learned last week, that was mainly because of the impact of floods and cyclones in various parts of the country. Our economy is more than 5% bigger than it was before the onset of the financial crisis. And those differences are for the most part reflected in what's happened to unemployment. Here in Australia, for 4 months in a row now, the unemployment rate has been below the 5% figure that since the mid-1970s has been regarded as consistent with full employment. Whereas in every other Western country bar Japan, the unemployment rate is pretty close to the highest it's been since the recessions that they had in the early 1980s. Even in New Zealand, the unemployment rate is close to 7%. Japan looks different, but that's only because for the last 10 years, Japan's labour force has been shrinking as a result of demographic change. And a lot of Japanese who've lost jobs or failed to get them in the last decade, and particularly since the financial crisis, simply don't show up in the figures as unemployed. They drop out of the labour force, and hence, in some ways, there's much more hidden unemployment in Japan than there is in many other Western countries. Notice that in the United States, over the last 2 months, the unemployment rate has actually started to edge up again. After falling over the previous 12 months, it's now back to 9.2%, because their economic recovery, which has never been particularly strong, seems to be losing some momentum again, in part because of the impact of rising petrol prices in the United States. What Asia's, and particularly China's and India's urbanisation and industrialisation is doing for Australia is further magnifying the difference between our economic experience and that of other Western countries because of our unusual for an advanced economic pattern of trade. Most Western countries are importers of commodities and exporters of manufactured goods. We unusually, for a Western country, are an importer of manufactured goods and an exporter of commodities. So the fact that China and India are pushing up the prices of commodities and pushing down the prices of manufactured goods as their ability to produce more of those at lower prices continues to improve, has a very different impact on us from the impact that it has on the other advanced economies that we normally compare ourselves with. What it's doing for Australia is driving up what economists call our terms of trade. That's the ratio of the prices we get for our exports to the prices we pay for our imports to record levels. There have been some occasions in the past when that ratio, the terms of trade, has been higher than it is today, and the most recent one of those was during the Korean War, when wool, which at the time was our biggest export, sold for £1 a pound in order to clothe soldiers who were fighting in the Korean War at that time. But as you can see, that never, nor previous commodity booms, never lasted particularly long. Whereas if you look at the orange line on that chart, which is a 5-year moving average of the terms of trade, there has never been, according to the Reserve Bank, such a sustained upswing in the terms on which we trade goods and services with other countries, as is going on today. Glenn Stevens, the Governor of the Central Bank, summed this up quite usefully a few months ago when he said that 5 years ago, Australians could get 2,000 flat-screen TVs in exchange for a shipload of iron ore, whereas today we can get 22,000 flat-screen TVs for each shipload of iron ore, partly because the price of flat-screen TVs has fallen, but more importantly because the price of iron ore has gone through the roof. And that kind of summarises what's going on here. So this is, even if, as the budget papers assume, commodity prices don't keep going up forever, Australia's going to get an enormous shot in the arm in terms of national income from the substantially higher prices that we stand to get for our commodity exports over the next, say, 10 to 15 years. But of course, in order to capitalise on what is, in reality, a once in human history opportunity to sell at extraordinarily high prices the minerals that have been lying under this surface and around this continent for millions of years, the mining industry actually has to create the wherewithal to dig up those minerals, get them out of holes in the ground, transport them to ports where they can be taken away on ships to China, India and other places that want to use them. And in order to accomplish that, the mining industry is undertaking the biggest capital expenditure boom, at least since the 1850s. If you think about it, the Victorian gold rushes were about blokes with picks and shovels, not capital expenditure, huge amounts of equipment and the like that is associated with mining projects today. So in both a price and a volume sense, this is the biggest commodity boom in Australia's history. Now that sounds in a sense good, but history also tells us that whenever we've been here before, we've managed to screw it up. Because at least since the Second World War, every commodities boom has been associated with a burst of double-digit inflation, and hence inevitably higher interest rates and recession. That is to say, historically, we've squandered the opportunities which the industrialisation and urbanisation of various of our trading partners have created for us. The highest inflation Australia's ever had was under the Menzies government in the early 1950s, when it got to over 20% in the aftermath of the Korean War. At the end of the late 1960s, early 1970s commodities boom, which was terminated by the first oil shock, inflation here got to 16.7% under the Whitlam government. And then the third time was in the rather briefer and smaller commodities boom that followed the second oil shock, when unions led by the metal workers pursued wage claims of over 20%, and the result was an inflation rate peaking at over 10%. Now it's true that there have been changes in the structure of Australia's economy and its institutions since the last commodities boom in the early 1980s that will lessen the likelihood that we repeat that history precisely during the present mining boom. First of all, we have a floating exchange rate, and although the stronger dollar is creating pain for some of our other export-oriented industries like manufacturing and tourism and even higher education, it's also helping to dampen inflationary pressures by making imported goods and services cheaper. We have an independent reserve bank that is charged with the task of keeping inflation below 3%, and it has the means to achieve that through higher interest rates, which it didn't have prior to the 1990s, when the Reserve Bank couldn't move interest rates at all unless the politicians said so. And we don't have a system of centralised wage fixing, which used to guarantee that the big wage increases that mining and construction unions could extract from their employers who could afford to pay them were also handed over to people, to workers in, say, health, retail, hospitality and other industries whose employers couldn't afford to pay them. So the economy is less inflation prone than it used to be. But nonetheless, even during what the present government calls mining boom Mark I, that is the period leading up to the onset of the financial crisis, Australia's inflation rate rose to a peak of 4.7% in the September quarter 2008. And it only started to come down because of the slowdown in the Australian economy and the temporary interruption to the mining boom that the global financial crisis caused. If that hadn't happened, if there hadn't been a financial crisis, if there hadn't been an interruption to the commodities boom, then who knows, the inflation rate here could have been on its way to 6 or 7%. And the issue really is that there isn't enough spare capacity in the Australian economy today to have a mining boom of the scale that it potentially will be without blowing the lid off the economy in the way that we've always done in the past. You might look at charts like these which show the level of capacity utilisation in industry and the unemployment rate and say, wasn't capacity utilisation higher in the years immediately before the financial crisis than it is today? And the answer to that's obviously yes. Wasn't the unemployment rate lower immediately before the onset of the financial crisis than it is today? And the answer is obviously yes. So how can you say there isn't enough spare capacity in the economy to absorb a mining boom? Well, the answer is, if you look at the grey bars there, they show the time period during which the underlying inflation rate was above the Reserve Bank's target of 2 to 3%. And as I mentioned before, that peaked at 4.7% in September 2008. This is the longest period that inflation has been outside the Reserve Bank's target range since they started targeting inflation in the early 1980s. In other words, the message is that in the years leading up to the financial crisis, the economy was actually overheating. It was operating at overfull employment, if you like, and ultimately that's unsustainable because it will lead to uncontrollable inflation, or at least to inflation that can only be controlled by raising interest rates to a level that will make a recession inevitable. And the Reserve Bank doesn't want to go there again, and it's pretty determined to make sure that doesn't happen. In its most recent forecasts, which it put out 4 days before last month's federal budget, the Reserve Bank said that apart from the impact of the Queensland floods and cyclones, which it predicted accurately would result in negative growth in the March quarter, it expected growth in the economy to return to what it calls an above-trend pace in 2012 and 2013. Above-trend pace means the economy is growing faster than its supply-side potential. And in those circumstances, it's not surprising that the Reserve Bank also forecasts, although you can't quite see it because of the black line there, that the underlying inflation rate would move to the top end of the target band in 2012 and break out of it, take my word for it, the orange line does come up behind that black bar, in 2013. And that's on the assumption that interest rates rise by 1/4 of a percentage point in 2012 and by another 1/4 of a percentage point in 2013.